Hi, everyone, and thank you to the CTE for having me today. My name is Vanessa Kitsey, and I'm an assistant professor at the School of Information Science. Broadly, what my work does is it looks at the broader social question that's asked by our field, and this question is how do people relate to, seek, and use information? I'm particularly interested in how sociocultural context shapes how people engage with information, and my work really focuses on LGBTQIA plus communities. I've offered one link to a research study that I'm working on that could be of interest for folks. It's looking at health information practices of South Carolina LGBTQIA plus communities. So that link is at the bottom of the slide here. If you're interested in checking it out, please go ahead and do so. So let's go ahead and get started. This is what our agenda looks like for today. And I just wanted to start with a quick note on vocabulary. You might have noticed that the name for this session was Acknowledging LGBTQIA Visibility. And I just wanted to spell out what LGBTQIA stands for. So that is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual. However, aside from being a mouthful to say through an hour and 15 minutes, it also doesn't encompass the full extent of sexualities and gender identities that people who don't identify as heterosexual or don't identify as cisgender might use to label themselves. And for that reason, I'm going to be using queer as an overarching label to refer to the populations. However, queer is a very complicated term, as we will see. So I want to get started by going over what this workshop is and what it isn't about, because you might have come in here with certain expectations, and I want to make sure to point out where you might engage with resources if I don't go over things that you thought we might have been going over today. So the first thing that this workshop is not about is it's not about helping queer students navigate challenges within the educational system. And this is because that assumes that queer students deviate from the norm and that their deviancies need to be dealt with, rather than looking inward to make any institutional or systemic change. This workshop also isn't about fostering queer inclusion, because this assumes that homophobia and transphobia are produced from a place of ignorance, and that including representations of queer people in our curriculum will solve that problem. And there are a few unintended consequences that can arise from this sort of a strategy. So first of all, in many cases, homophobia and transphobia don't stem from someone's unawareness of queer people existing in the world. Most people are very aware that queer people are here and that they exist. So providing queer representation in class may reframe queer people from being ones to avoid to ones to pity instead. Further, the representations of queer people chosen in class may be negative or stigmatizing, or they could present only one right way to be queer when there are multiple ways that you can be queer. And then finally, this workshop isn't about fostering tolerance of queer people. Tolerance signifies telling students that it's okay to be queer. And this again suggests that being queer is somehow undesirable. Also, when faced with the violence directed at queer people, especially experienced by certain groups like trans women of color, it's not always okay for someone to be queer. It doesn't necessarily get better for everyone. And so while the strategies that I've just gone over are needed, and I don't think any of them are inherently bad, they're limited. And I engage in some of these strategies in my classes. For example, I think it's really important to have queer representation. And sometimes this does cause shifts in thinking among students. But the reason why this workshop isn't about these three principles is because what I want to advance is this idea that these strategies are limited because they often operate from the assumption that being queer is not normal, it's somehow deviant, or it's wrong. And further, they're often the extent of the actions that people take on this topic. So all of this being said and giving you these caveats, I don't want to shut you off from engaging in any of these strategies. And so what I've done is I've had two of my awesome doctoral research assistants create a handout with resources that provide information about navigating challenges within the educational system, inclusion and tolerance as related to queer issues. And so those are available to you in the handout you should have gotten with the reminder for this workshop. So we've talked a lot about knots. What is this workshop actually about? So the first thing it's about is building practice that centers on difference. So in this workshop, we're going to be talking about how to leverage queer pedagogy, and I'm going to go over what exactly I mean when I say queer pedagogy in a moment. So we'll talk about how to leverage queer pedagogy among ourselves and our students to understand the multiple forms of knowledge and ignorance that exist within the classroom. This workshop is also about encouraging us to question the stories that we tell ourselves about knowledge. So rather than focusing on common concerns for teaching, what students know and how we should teach this knowledge, we'll instead focus on how we come to know things and who gets to know what. And then finally, and I really want to emphasize this last point, this workshop is about providing examples rather than best practices. So what I'm trying to do in this workshop is to cultivate and exercise an unfamiliar analytical muscle among many of us, which is queer pedagogy. And while I'll provide some practical suggestions and approaches for where to start, I also want to encourage all of you to take what you've learned following the workshop and apply it to your unique classroom context. An approach that works in one class might not work in another. And in this way, you'll also contribute to queer pedagogy's development and growth. What you all have pointed out by saying things like queer is highly contextual and it can mean different things based on different contexts is that there's no standard or stable definition for queer. So instead, what I'm going to do here is provide you with a definitional framework. And again, a framework because there aren't fixed definitions. And so in general, there are three kind of broadly accepted and utilized meanings of the term queer. So the first is queer as a subject position. So this is for folks who said that queer represents an identity. These are people whose gender identities and sexualities fall outside what is considered normal. It functions from the position of who is quote unquote normal, and this includes all LGBTQIA plus people. So if we think of queer as more of like an identity label, we would lump all LGBTQIA plus folks under that identity label. We can also think about queer as a politic. And so these are for the folks who were using queer as a verb, like queer is doing something, queer is challenging, queer is questioning. And so queer as a politic challenges the status quo and rejects assimilation into the mainstream. And so I'm going to give you kind of an example here. So not all LGBTQIA plus people engage in queerness as politic or as a political critique. So whereas queer as a subject position kind of encompasses all LGBTQIA plus folks, queer as a politic doesn't necessarily encompass all LGBTQIA plus folks. It also might encompass people who identify outside of the LGBTQIA plus umbrella. And what's important here with queer as a politic is that LGBTQIA plus mainstream organizations, such as the Human Rights Campaign, which is a civil rights organization for LGBTQIA plus equality, tend to emphasize the narrative that we're just like you in every way except for sexuality or gender identity. And that's often why there's an emphasis in lobbying by groups like HRC that's placed on issues like marriage or serving in the military. In a way, this is rendering LGBTQIA plus people as quote unquote normal. So if you're adopting queer as politic, you're rejecting those sorts of narratives. And then finally, we could think about queer as an aesthetic sensibility. And so this is something that I saw less of in the chat, but this is where we think of queer as being subversion, and we try to see queerness in what we interact with on a daily basis. It's the seeking out of subversive content in texts, such as art, music, literature, and academic papers. So an example here might be identifying homoerotic themes in a novel like The Picture of Dorian Gray, or my personal favorite, which is reading Bert and Ernie as lovers on Sesame Street. Don't know if anyone else does that, but I certainly do. And so that would be an example of queer functioning as an aesthetic sensibility. So we're moving toward queer, yeah, totally to Bert and Ernie. So we're moving from thinking about how to define queer to how we can take those definitions and think about them within our classrooms and within academic contexts. And this is through the lens of queer theory. And queer theory tends to examine how the labels that we use in order to describe ourselves, and particularly in this context, those related to gender and sexuality, are shaped by ideologies that control what we do by minimizing our sense of self. And just to give you here like a very, I think, obvious example, when we think about gender labels, particularly binary gender labels such as male and female, which are applied to us often based on the sex to which we're assigned at birth, we tend to feel very constrained based on our socialization and the roles and expressions that we should adopt based on the label that we're given. So an important claim that's made within queer theory is that we construct binaries using labels to make sense of the world. We can only understand what, for example, heterosexuality is if we also understand what homosexuality is. And what queer theory tends to argue is that we often attempt to suppress the categories that are non-dominant, and the fact that often these categories depend on their opposites in order to normalize those categories. So for example, we normalize a given category like heterosexual as being normal and natural by kind of ignoring or framing its opposite, which is homosexuality, as something that's deviant. And what queer theory also looks to do is to explore possibilities beyond labels and binary categories. However, queer theory is not without critique, and there are some examples of this. So for instance, we could accept queer theory's claim that labels tend to tell people how to live, but of course labels can also be really important for institutional recognition. So we can think of examples of this where laws are passed, for example, that include certain labels of people, and this can be important. It can also be really important to have a label in order to find community. And another critique of queer theory is that if we establish queer as a category, doesn't that create its own binary of queer and not queer? So in other words, queer theory is all about breaking down binaries, but by using labels, binaries, we're essentially reproducing that system. But that was kind of my academic aside. Even with these concerns, I think that queer theory can be a very powerful tool because it goes beyond just focusing on gender and sexuality. It has a broader focus on how we maintain normal. And anytime I say the word normal, by the way, there's like an exaggerated eye roll and air quotes on my end going with it, just to let you know. So queer theory has a broader focus on how normal is defined and managed. And so therefore we can apply queer theory to highlight other forms of difference and inequality. And totally, Tony, even saying binary or non-binary is binary, right? So again, that's one of the key critiques of queer theory, is that unfortunately we're ensconced within these systems. We rely on labels and language. And so even as we critique them, we have to use them in order to make that critique. So going back to this idea that queer theory is about really questioning what's normal and what's not normal, I think that that's a key strength to applying queer theory to the way that we do pedagogy, because you might be laying down a foundation intended for specific people. So in this specific workshop, we're focusing on queer people, but ultimately I think this foundation is productive for everyone. I tend to use the metaphor here of a curb cut in a sidewalk. This was originally created to accommodate people in wheelchairs, but of course curb cuts benefit all kinds of people, like bike riders, parents with strollers, runners. I use curb cuts as a bike rider because I've never been able to hop the curb. Not that cool. And so when we think about queer theory, we can roughly match 3 definitions of queer that we went over in the last slide, and that I think that y'all provided in the chat as well, with how queer theory thinks about that label. So queer theory thinks about queer as a noun. In other words, the study of queer people. So much like music theory, for example, is about the study of music. Queer theory also thinks about queer as an adjective. And so this is basically the idea that we're critiquing what theory should look like, or in the case of pedagogy, we're critiquing what we think pedagogy should look like. And what we should think here is that queer theory is full of contradictions. So as you know, Tony brought up, for example, queer theory eschews labels, but we must necessarily adopt labels in order to define the purpose of queer theory. And finally, queer as a verb. And so this is where we're literally acting on theory itself, or as we'll talk about in a second, pedagogy, and literally queering it. And so here we're going to look at theories or classroom practices that might not be explicitly queer from a different perspective in order to identify their shortcomings, underlying assumptions, and possibilities, rather than just kind of accepting them as they are, accepting them a priori. So to just provide you with some definitions to consider what queer pedagogy could mean, queer pedagogy can be defined as a radical form of educative practice implemented deliberately to interfere with, to intervene in the production of normalcy in schooled subjects. So again, I think that dovetails really nicely with how folks are talking about binaries like authoritative and non-authoritative, or teacher or student. So we're questioning what we consider to be normal, and often that's the production of those sorts of binaries. A key aim of queer pedagogy is that teaching is not the transmission of ready-made knowledge. It is rather the creation of a new condition of knowledge, the creation of an original learning disposition. And so here I really think about Pedagogy of the Oppressed, that very fundamental text to often informing our teaching practice, and how in that work there's a lot of talking about called the banking model of education. And so that's where we traditionally view our students as having these kind of like open heads that we just go ahead and dump knowledge into. I come from librarianship as a background, and often we position librarians in very much the same way as these experts who provide information to needy individuals. So it's very much a deficit sort of model to education. And so what queer pedagogy tries to do is it tries to shift us from that sort of banking model of education to one in which we're co-constructing knowledge with our students. And so what queer pedagogy does specifically is it takes our original goal that knowledge is something that we can and should master, to asking questions about knowledge itself. Again, what is knowledge? Who gets to know? And for this reason, queer pedagogy is an approach rather than a series of instructional techniques or universal best practices. And so again, that goes back to my initial caveat at the beginning of this session, is that I'm not giving you best practices because I don't think that those actually exist. So what I want to do next, rather than give you those best practices, is to instead outline some various themes that describe and organize queer pedagogical approaches. And then what I'll do is provide some examples and suggestions for how these approaches can be adopted in the classroom. And again, these examples and suggestions should be viewed as simply that, examples and suggestions, rather than prescriptive best practices. So I want to take a look now at 4 different queer pedagogical approaches. And so this looks at queer pedagogy as the study of limits, ignorance, reading practices, and disclosure. So the first one I want to look at is queer pedagogy as the study of limits. And so queer pedagogy as the study of limits really examines the unmarked criteria to dismiss as irrelevant or valorize as relevant a particular mode of thought, field of study, or insistence upon the real. And so when we're thinking about queer pedagogy as the study of limits, What we're trying to do is to consider what is being made visible in our classroom and what are we leaving out and why. And so a suggestion for practice here when thinking about queer pedagogy as the study of limits is that when you're planning or developing a class, instead of asking what information do I want to convey to my students or that they should be getting out of the class, instead what you want to ask are those co-constructive sorts of questions, like what questions shall we ask of each other? And after we explore those questions, what's been left out? And then what other questions shall we ask of each other? And so really this is a praxis-oriented approach in which you're creating knowledge with your students and thinking about the limits of what you have decided to teach them and interrogating why those limits exist. So some concrete approaches to achieve this with examples, since that was kind of very high level, is to include information in your classes on who and what was left out when a specific body of knowledge or fact was developed. And so before I got a shout out for discussing music theory, and I want to give you examples that kind of range the different sorts of classes that you might be teaching to show that you can engage in all of these queer pedagogical approaches even if you're not teaching a women and gender studies course. So again, going back to this first approach, which is basically including information on who or what was left out when a specific body of knowledge or fact was developed, I want to appeal to Egyptology here. So I'm originally, or I moved here, I should say, from Brooklyn, and I loved the Brooklyn Museum. I lived right by it when I was there, and I went one day and saw an exhibit on ancient Egypt, and specifically gender in ancient Egypt. And what I found out is that it was believed that only men could live on after death. And so in order to prepare a man's body to transition to the afterlife, he was mummified in a certain way. And so specifically, what folks would do is they would describe him with a masculine word for you on his coffin, and they would also paint an image of him with red skin on the sarcophagus. What Egyptologists found is that in some instances, when they would go and see these sarcophagi, there were actually women who were mummified in this way. And so when they first saw this, they passed off that sort of mummification as like a mistake. Said, oh, well, you know, these people must have made an error. They actually would only mummify men in this sort of way because they believed that only men could pass on to the afterlife. However, recently, scholars have actually reinterpreted, and this is what I learned when I went to the museum, they've recently reinterpreted what was once passed off as a mistake and not worth knowing as something different. They actually reinterpreted it as an effort by Egyptians to transition some women into the afterlife by briefly transforming them into men. And so as you can see, there was some gender fluidity going on here in these practices that wasn't necessarily recognized by Egyptologists because they were kind of stuck in this idea of what was normal and what is worth knowing. And so by providing this sort of an example to students taking a class on Egyptian history, for example, this is a way to illustrate to them how knowledge is consistently reinterpreted, renegotiated, and redefined. And by providing these sorts of examples, I think you really engender students with a desire to ask questions related to who and what were left out in the creation of specific knowledges and how that affects how we come to know something. Another approach to achieve this idea of queer pedagogy as the study of limits is to ask students how the world may be different if we approach knowledge using alternative strategies. So for example, you're teaching a pharmacology class. You might ask what clinical trials would look like if we didn't group people into binaries by gender. What new conclusions would we draw, and how might medicine change as a result? Or say you're teaching a coding class. You might want to ask to your students, what would a coding language look like that doesn't use binary logic, and how would you design it? So again, just some examples there, but just to re-summarize here, when we're thinking about queer pedagogy as the study of limits, the limit here is in our own field of knowledge and how we represent that field. The limit is not with the students. And so what we're trying to do here is to engage students in a co-construction of knowledge in which they're thinking through with you what's limited about your field and how you're teaching it, which is queer pedagogy as the study of ignorance. And so what we do here is we shift ignorance from a thing that has to be overcome to a useful pedagogical tool. And so we've talked a little bit about this before. This also came up in the chat. So we're trying to reject that sort of banking model of education. And so what this approach offers is a queer perspective on ignorance, and specifically the fact that ignorance is not always an absence of knowledge. Instead, what ignorance often is an incompatibility of the new knowledge with what people already know. And so an example of this is that often, I think now QAnon is something that comes up, a very popular conspiracy theory. And so often when I personally am reading about folks who believe in QAnon, I might immediately think, oh, well, they're really ignorant, right? They don't understand anything about politics and how it actually works. But in reality, a lot of folks who ascribe to QAnon, and again, I'm just using this as an example here, they tend to be very knowledgeable about conspiracy theories, and about that one in particular. In order to ascribe to that conspiracy theory, you have to know a lot, and there's a lot to keep track of and symbolism that you have to follow. And so I would argue that those folks aren't necessarily ignorant. Instead, that ignorance that we're talking about is not a lack of knowledge, but it's rather an active refusal to integrate new information that might challenge what people already know and believe. What queer theory tends to argue is that it's important to understand what people, or your students in this case, already know by determining what they're resistant to knowing. So you can understand what they already know by seeing what they're resistant to incorporate into their knowledge. And so some suggestions for practice here. So the first one is that instead of assuming that the information studied in your class doesn't pose a problem to students, you might want to ask instead, what does this information do to a student's sense of self? And what does this knowledge ask them to reconsider about themselves and the subject studied? Because often I think we just, give students information, and as long as they don't challenge it, we think that they've just accepted it. And instead, what we might want to question is, what are students taking for granted, or what are they likely to take for granted? And how might that make them resistant to new information? And so some different approaches to achieve this. The first is to have students to reflect on an instance in which they may have thought about volunteering information in class, but ultimately decided not to. What was it about that information that made the student want to exclude it from the conversation? You can also mirror this reflection within your own pedagogical practice. So think about in class when you might have been teaching, what information did you choose to exclude from a class, and why did you choose to exclude it? And what might that say about your resistance to? And so I can give you a personal example here about what I didn't include in this workshop, which is that one argument that's made within queer pedagogy is that there's a link between education, sexuality, and pleasure. However, I chose not to really incorporate that into the discussion because I thought it'd be a contentious topic since we don't normally sexualize the practice of education. And so that decision says something larger about what we assume is normal and how we maintain it, and what we choose to teach about a subject and what we choose to leave out. And so this approach is looking at queer pedagogy as the study of reading practices. And so we've talked about this a little bit throughout this presentation, I think, as you'll come to see. And it's also, I think, the most conventional way that when we think about queer pedagogy, or we think about LGBTQIA plus visibility in the classroom, I think that we often go right here. And specifically when we apply a queer pedagogical lens to the study of reading practices, we think about reading as operating in two different ways. The first is incorporating texts about and from the perspectives of queer people into your class, and then also encouraging your students to read queerly. And so approaches to achieve this, and I think that this first approach is probably at the most of our minds when we think about incorporating any sort of diversity into our courses, which is assigning texts written by queer authors and or focusing on queer experiences. Now, this can be complicated, particularly if people don't necessarily outwardly identify as queer. I think where you address this is by the bullet point number 2, which is reading queerly. So perhaps reading into something written by someone who hasn't necessarily identified as queer, at least outwardly, but reading into like the subversion of that sort of text. So again, the Bert and Ernie shipping, I think, is one example here. But going back to this idea of assigning text written by queer authors and or focusing on queer experiences, one of the things I wanted to point out here is that you want to focus on informal sources like websites and other gray literature, which is often where queer people publish because they don't necessarily have access to more formal publication venues or channels. And I can give you an example here. This is the one that I said before is tangentially related to engineering, which is that I teach a class called social informatics. And this is basically looking at the relationship between people and technology. I call it like sociology for engineers. So that's where that relationship comes from. And I have a unit there which is on artificial intelligence. And every single class without fail, I assign this piece by Sasha Constanza-Chalk. And they identify as non-binary, transgender, and femme presenting. And they write about millimeter wave scanning used at airports. So that's essentially what you walk through when you go through airport security. And they integrate their own personal experiences of walking through that scanner, as well as the particular like technology of the scanner and what it does and does not say about your gender. And what I do when we read about this is we really, as a class, think through what technology tends to say about gender and how that can shape someone's experiences of the technology. And yeah, shout out to Nicole, Design Justice. And I think there are a couple of chapters actually of that book that are now freely available. If you follow Sasha on Twitter, they've tweeted out their free chapters. So we do that, and that's just one example of how you can assign a text that really speaks to one queer person's experiences that's relevant to a specific field of study. The second thing that you can do is to interrogate students and then, of course, your own readings of texts. And so you might want to ask students questions like, why did I understand the text to mean that and not something else? What meanings did I want to find, and what meanings did I to avoid finding? And then how does my reading preserve normalcy for the speaker's race, gender, and or sexual identity, or for my own? How else could one read it? What else could it mean? And so to extend my previous example, often with my students, we think about our own positionalities and how that might impact our different experiences when we go to the airport, if we are able to even afford to go to the airport to take a flight. And so, for instance, as a cis white woman who's a US native, I don't think twice of going through airport security unless I'm in a really long line and it's holding me up. But I have other students in my class who might not identify as queer, but for example, I've had some Black students who will be like, well, going through TSA scanning is a nightmare for me because I always get pulled out after I go through the scanner. And so we start to think about all of the human-centric practices around that technology, not just the technology itself. And so what you can ask students is how might their relationship to that specific technology change if they didn't have those privileged identities? So again, this idea of really interrogating what it is that you're reading, what in your classes, and then what's included and what's also left out, and how that might be experienced by people with different social locations of difference. All right, so moving ahead to our last approach to talk about today is queer pedagogy as a study of disclosure. And so this is specifically related to how you might present yourself to your class, as well as how your students might present themselves to you and what sort of responsibilities or roles you have in that process. And so what I want to go over here is questions specifically related to whether it's productive for, if you identify as a queer instructor, to disclose that in your classroom, and then also the responsibility of students to disclose their queer identities to you. So let's start with instructors. I think it's often assumed that instructors who feel safe doing so should come out to their students to provide queer visibility and act as a queer role model. Again, this session is called Acknowledging LGBTQIA plus Visibility in the Classroom. So we might think, oh, we're queer, we can be visible, and that's a wonderful thing. However, there are some considerations to making this sort of assumption. And the first is that by outing yourself to your class, what you're assuming is that people know what they should come out as, and therefore that their identities are stable and already recognized by students. The second is that this strategy could detract from the visibility of other queer people. And so, for example, within academia, often it tends to consist of individuals who are neurotypical, able-bodied, middle class, and have a host of other privileged identity intersections. And so therefore, this could potentially limit students' knowledge of what possibilities for queer identity expression exist beyond those sorts of representations. Another thing is that if you have a specific label that you can attach to your identity, you're kind of communicating that that label is something that is needed in order to be queer. And so inadvertently, of course, I don't think that anyone intends to do that, but that could also be something that detracts from students feeling comfortable with having their instructor out themselves. And then for students asking about their queer identity, there are some of the same concerns there. So students may feel more comfortable, for example, disclosing their sexualities and gender identities if they fall into stable categories or have labels that they can use to describe them. And so this again can detract from the visibilities of multiple and fluid identities within the classroom. So giving you these caveats, that doesn't mean that I'm trying to say that you should not be a visible queer instructor, but that there are other ways that you can do that. And Sarah, I'm going to get to your comment because I think that this is, like, for sure a really important point in one moment. But I think from the instructor perspective, rather than coming out as a specific identity category, instead you might think about the various ways that you can act queerly or engage in queer identity expressions in your interactions with students. I'm going to give a very obvious example to begin with. So if you're male identified, and let's say you have a pink shirt that you've been avoiding wearing in class, wear the shirt. That would be my very obvious example. But some other more nuanced examples would be thinking about enacting different gendered performances in class. So one example here would be using more masculine performances when you're doing things like setting boundaries and giving assignments, and more feminine performances to draw students out and help them feel more comfortable in the classroom. And going back to this idea of, giving queer visibility to yourself as an instructor, rather than labeling yourself, one of the things that you might do when acting queerly is to acknowledge elements of your identity that challenge what students might think of you. So one thing that I often do is I'll casually bring up my female identified partner, because in that sort of a way, I'm not really telling students that I'm a particular identity category, but instead my goal is to really disrupt their assumptions of what my relationship might look like. So now I want to go back to Sarah's comment. And so what Sarah is saying here is introducing with pronouns, and this idea of the hypervisibility that you might have if you're using your pronouns and their alternative in a room of people who do not share the those pronouns and feeling a great deal of pressure to do so. And then Sarah concludes by saying, the funny thing is, this practice was designed to accommodate people like me, and I would be wrong to not acknowledge that a lot of non-binary people really appreciate these practices, to acknowledge their existence and validity, so it's just really complicated. So I do want to go into this use of pronouns a little bit now, which is to say, yes, and thank you for sharing, Sarah. Don't assume that your students wish to disclose their sexualities and gender identities. And so going back to this idea of pronouns, I too classroom when I first started teaching, and I thought that I was going to be like the woke professor who was going to come in and be like, everyone, let's go around the room and share pronouns, see how cool and accepting I look. So it really wasn't even about fostering inclusion or acceptance for my students. It was more about like me wanting to make myself look good, which is something that, you know, I admitted when I was like queerly challenging my own pedagogy. And so when I went into this first class, I had all of my students share their pronouns at the beginning of class. And at the end of class, I had one student who then approached me and they said that they use they, them pronouns, but they didn't feel comfortable disclosing this to the whole class. They felt like they were being put on the spot, much like Sarah is talking about with the sharing of pronouns. And so what this experience showed me is that for some students, this practice can be really beneficial, and Sarah also said this, and make students feel like they're in a space. But for others, this practice might actually make them feel unsafe and further excluded. And so, again, this is a really complicated issue. I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't refer to our students how they want to be referred to, but we really have to think carefully through how we want them to perform this sort of a task. So one of the ways that you can actually do it, and the way that I do it, is a getting to know you sort of like survey that I pass out on the first day of class. And it's just ask students to give me a couple of details about themselves. One of the things that I do is I have them write down the name that they want to go by, because one of the things you also have to consider is that students are often required to provide their legal first name for student records, and that's what's going to pop up on your course rosters, but that's not necessarily what the students want to be referred to as. And so rather than singling out those students by taking attendance and reading their names, what you can always do in that first class is collect that sort of information, and then you have that so that you know how to refer to that student when you're taking roll call. And in that survey that I do, I ask students to provide their pronouns, and I say provide them if you're comfortable. And then I ask the questions, are you comfortable with me using these pronouns in class? Are you comfortable just with me using these pronouns when you and so I ask in the different situations where they feel comfortable with those pronouns being used. One of the things that I will say is don't put the onus on the student to correct you. So don't assume you know what the student's pronouns are and then say, oh, come up to me and correct me if I'm wrong, or just raise your hand, because what it does is that normalizes using a gender binary, which is something that we don't want to do in queer pedagogical practice. And Gloria, absolutely, I could share my survey with you. I will write down a reminder to do that, but I'm happy to share that survey. And I will also share an article, because these are not my brilliant ideas, even though I would love to take credit for them. But there's an article written by Oliver Hanson all about this and strategies for disclosure in the classroom that don't kind of like engender this sort of hypervisibility. So in conclusion, I think the first thing to think about when we're queer pedagogy is that it's a consistent process of challenging normalcy. So again, being queer isn't wrong, but the systems and institutions that position queer as being wrong are what's the problem. And so we need to reflect that into our teaching practice rather than considering queer as the point of deviance. The second is that, and I'm sure that I'm beating this over everyone's heads, but there are no universal solutions or best practices here. This is highly contextual. Much like there's not a singular queer identity or way to be. And so what we have to think of here is that we really need to tailor our practice to our unique classroom identities and our unique students that we have in those classes. And then finally, I hope that you've gotten the importance of self-reflexivity that goes into this. I've also tried to incorporate that into the questions that I've been asking you. So it's really crucial to reflexively question our own practice and praxis and the classroom environments that it produces, to think through how we might inadvertently be maintaining homo and cisnormativity. So in other words, this idea that being hetero and cisnormativity. So this idea that being heterosexual and cisgender is normal.